Shalom, Bruchim Habayim, and welcome to Shevi'im Panim LaTorah, to the 70 faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Shemot, which is the Torah portion of names. In fact, we are in a new Chumash of the Torah. We are now in the Chumash of Shemot, which in English we call the Book of Exodus. And I've decided to subtitle this teaching From Out of the Depths. In this week's Torah portion, we read that after settling in Mitzrayim, the Jewish people begin to suffer difficult hardships. In fact, the Torah says that it was from these difficult hardships that the Jewish people began to cry out to God. We read here in Shmuel Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. The Torah says, "Vaye'anechu v'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah vayiz'aku v'ta'al shavatam el ha'elokim min ha'avodah." And the children of Israel groaned from the work, and their cry ascended, crying to God from the work. There's a few questions I would like to raise about the rendering of this pasuk, specifically the way the Torah renders it. First question I'd like to bring up here is, why does the Torah say that the groaning of the Jewish people came after the death of the old Paro? Okay, we know that the old Paro was the individual who appointed Yosef to his position in Mitzrayim. And a couple verses before this passage here, in Exodus 2:23, it talks about a new Paro coming to power. And that this new Paro did not recognize Yosef. It says that he did not know him. Not that he did not literally know him. Rather, he didn't recognize Yosef as someone legitimate, considering that he was a Jew and he was an outsider to the whole Egyptian system. And so we see that this new Paro comes to power. He then turns his focus upon the Jews, and he begins to make their lives a living hell. He starts to put burdens upon them, and he starts to strip them of any prestige that they were enjoying in the land of Mitzrayim. And it's at this point, the Torah mentions that the Jewish people begin to cry out to Hashem. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at this verse, it's interesting in the way the Torah decided to phrase and describe the Jewish people's suffering. The Torah says, "Vaye'anechu v'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah," and the children of Israel groaned from the work, the avodah. And then it says, "Vayiz'aku v'ta'al," and their cry ascended. Now, the Torah could have simply wrote this verse this way. It could have just said, "Vaye'anechu vayiz'aku v'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah," and the children of Israel groaned and cried from the work, "Vata'al shavatam el ha'elokim min ha'avodah," and their cry ascended to God from the work. So why didn't the Torah simply say it this way? Why didn't it just say they groaned and cried? Why is there a separation? Why say, okay, they groaned min ha'avodah from the work, and then vayizachu vata'al, and their cry ascended shavatam el ha'elokim min ha'avodah, okay, crying to God from the work? Why? There's a lot of redundancy here. Why is that? Not only that, there's a repetition of the word min avodah here, okay, from the work. It's being repeated 2 times. Why is that? Why is the Torah being repeated over here 2 times? Not only that, when we take a look at this verse, we see that the Torah refers to 3 different connotations of crying or discomfort. You have vaye'anechu, that's the first word. The second is vayizaku, and then the third word is shavatam. Okay, these have 3 different connotations when it comes to crying out or feeling pain, feeling anguish. In fact, if we take a look here, I'll pull it up on the screen, the word anach from vaye'anechu, that describes sighing or groaning from a feeling of discomfort. And that could refer to discomfort on different levels, depending on the context. A person could sigh because they're emotionally frustrated. A person could sigh because they're mentally depressed. A person could sigh because maybe they have an acute form of pain, maybe like something like arthritis or maybe a bee sting, and they sigh from something, right? They feel discomfort, they feel bruising or something. That could be a physical connotation of discomfort. And so that's what anach represents. The word za'ak, on the other hand, from vayizaku, well, that refers to a person who's crying out because they're in dire need of help. They're really hurting. They're in dire need. In fact, it could be compared to, let's say, a person, chasis chalila, they have an accident while they're hiking a mountain, and they fall down, they break their leg, and there's no one around, and they're yelling out, they're screaming, they're crying out, right? Because they're in desperate need, they're in dire need here. This is what Za'ak represents. And so the Torah is describing the Jews are not just in this discomfort, there's this sighing and groaning, but also they're crying out to God. And last but least, we have the word shavah. Shavah for shavatam. This refers to a person who cries from being broken, a person who's in a state of brokenness. Okay? And so the Torah is describing that the Jews are feeling discomfort on 3 different levels. Okay? And that they're crying out in dire need, they're crying out from being broken, and they're crying out because they're feeling discomfort. The Torah says that the Jewish people felt discomfort from the avodah after the death of the first Paro that appointed Yosef to power. As soon as he died, this is when they begin to feel some discomfort. Okay? So what was so comfortable about the avodah before the king's death? Before his death, after his death, what's really the difference? I mean, you're living in a non-Jewish nation. It's not your homeland. What could be so comfortable about living there? So by rendering the verse of Vaye'anechu v'niyisrael min ha'avodah vayizachu v'ta'al instead of Vaye'anechu vayizachu v'niyisrael min ha'avodah, it would indicate that the word vayizachu is not being written because Israel is crying out about suffering enslavement. Rather, they're crying out about something else. And this is also something I would like to address here regarding a lot of people's misconceptions and misnomers of how they understand the Jews when they lived in Mitzrayim. A lot of people tend to read the Bible based upon historical events that have happened in human history. A lot of people, when they read about the Jews suffering in Mitzrayim, they think that there's some type of similarity of what happened in 1555 during the transatlantic slave trade, when many Africans were brought over to the islands and also the southern portion of the United States, where they were forced to work on plantation fields, where they suffered underneath slavery. This is not the same thing, okay? Now, it doesn't mean that the Jews were not treated indiscriminately, or they were discriminated against, and they were treated with anti-Semitism. Yes, there were. However, what you have to understand is, as King Solomon says, "Ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh." There's nothing new under the sun, specifically in Jewish history where everything is cyclical. Okay, what happened in Mitzrayim was that the Jews were living very prestige lives. They were living very comfortable. They were living off the zechut, of the merit of their fathers, because this is the second generation that is now living in Mitzrayim. The first generation that came down was Yaakov, Yosef, and the tribal leaders. Now this is the second generation that's there. And they're living comfortable, right? They're living off of the merit of what Yosef did on behalf of the Jewish people. And we see that as this new Paro comes to power, he doesn't recognize Yosef. He thinks he's an illegitimate outsider. And because he doesn't recognize Yosef, he's not going to recognize the Jews. So what does he do? Well, he forces them to have to work hard. And that meant that he stripped them of anything that they had earned in Egyptian society. This has been something that has plagued the Jews in many situations throughout history. You go back to Nazi Germany, and you see where the Jews living across Europe, they had their own businesses, they had their own stores, they were lawyers, they were doctors, they were in theatrics and theatrical performances. And as soon as anti-Semitism and the conspiracy theories about Jews began to spread, immediately they were stripped of their positions, they were kicked out of their professions. And where were they sent to? They were sent into the ghettos. That's where they were sent at. And now they're working for pennies on the dollar. We know that when Nazi Germany totally took over, Jews were redirected to live in these, these Fardoma housing projects, and where they were basically working, welfare jobs, making artillery shells for Nazi war machines, or, basically, waxing boots for Nazi soldiers. Those who were not selected to be like, worker bees per se, then they were shipped off to the death camps, sadly, where they experienced death. And even in the death camps, they were doing mindless work. The Nazis were just playing games with them. And this has happened in every area where the society turned on the Jews. They were stripped of their rights, stripped of their privileges, stripped of the luxury that they had, and they were forced to live inside the ghettos. This is exactly what was happening in Mitzrayim. Mind you, Goshen may not have been a ghetto per se. It was a nice suburb of Mitzrayim, but nonetheless, that's where the Jews were limited to live at, and that meant they had to go out and work, and they were working 3 times harder than an average Egyptian would, pennies on the dollars, and therefore they were working a job, right? They were not treated like it was a plantation field. They were working a job, and so they would just go back to their community. There was segregation, and that's what they were doing there. So if the Jews are not crying out because they're feeling the brunt of the what we call the Shibut Mitzrayim, the bondage of Egypt, what were they crying out about? I like to delineate over here to the Kliyat Kar, and the Kliyat Kar makes an eye-opening statement in this week's Torah portion. The Kliyat Kar says, in God's eyes, the Jews were wicked sinners and were not worthy of redemption. That's a very eye-opening statement from somebody like the Kliyat Kar. But what does he mean? Well, if the Jews were not groaning and crying out due to slavery, then what was making them cry out to God? The end of the verse says, Shavatam el ha'elokim min ha'avodah. That from a broken place, they were broken, from being broken, as when they begin to cry out to God, min ha'avodah. What's avodah, right? Depending on the context and depending on what you're talking about, avodah can mean work, it can mean bondage, it can refer sometimes to slavery, like another form of synonym for bondage, right? But bondage can also mean like an addiction. So it depends, right? Whatever that, avodah is evit, okay? Someone who's a servant to something. However, the lashon of avodah, the root of it, also refers to the concept of worship. So if we were to read here that the Jews groaned and they cried out from the worship, what does that mean, okay? Now, we can't think of worship in the westernization of what worship means, like images of people prostrating themselves, people lifting their hands, people singing songs, not in the literal way of what avodah represents, okay? Because avodah also carries a connotation of a worship which also alludes to a state of mind. And so what I would like to suggest is that since the Kliyat Kar found that the verse indicates that Israel was evil in God's eyes and unworthy to be redeemed, that when the verse uses the word avodah, it's alluding to Israel crying out to God from their worship. Once again, worship is not limited to the westernization of it. Rather, it's what one does with their spiritual being. So we have to consider that under the old Paro, the Jewish people became very comfortable. They became very complacent living amongst their non-Jewish counterparts there. And they were also living off the merit of their fathers. And so they were enjoying the bounty of the land, living comfortable in the suburb, there a Goshen. And so in a way, the Jews begin to worship this system. Now, they may have not, literally bowed down to worship deities like the Mitzrayim did, not to say that there couldn't have been some Jews who fell victim to that. Rather, they felt complacent. They became complacent in their service of God. In fact, the Midrash, this week's Parashat, I don't have the quotation here, mentions that instead of influencing Mitzrayim, the Mitzrayim was influencing the Jews. And therefore, the Jews are found everywhere. They were at the shuk, they were at the actual, at the stock exchange. And therefore, they were becoming greatly influenced from Egyptian society. They were becoming assimilated. We also see when Hashem takes the Jews out of Mitzrayim, right? They're in the wilderness. And it's like, even though Hashem took the Jews out of Mitzrayim, he still has to take Mitzrayim from out of the Jews. And so what we see here is that avodah is not just based upon bowing down to a statue. It's also the state of one's mind, and it's what one does with their spiritual being. So when the Kliyat Kar says that the Jews were perceived as wicked in the eyes of Hashem, he's alluding to the fact that the Jews were worshiping everything but God. They were putting all their spiritual energy into Mitzrayim and not into Hashem. And so God had to use the death of the old Paro that was associated with Yosef to cause the Jews to cry out to him, min ha'avodah, cry out from that system that they were worshiping, from a shavatam el ha'elokim, from a state of brokenness, is when they began to cry out to God. God was breaking them, because now they can enjoy the prestige life of Mitzrayim. They're no longer respected. The nation is turning on them. I mean, imagine that. You're well respected. You're considered heroes, maybe to many of the non-Jews in Mitzrayim, because of your relative Yosef, right? Your relative Yaakov. You're respected there. But then suddenly, anti-Semitism rears its head in the middle of the night, and now you're an enemy to the Egyptian people. Hey, ask the Jews what it was like in Poland and Austria and many other parts of Europe, that when they woke up one day, they were, praised and they were honored amongst their non-Jewish colleagues, and then suddenly after the rise of Nazi Germany, they were treated as enemies. They were treated as basically snakes, and therefore nobody wanted to do business with the Jews. So the Torah tells us when Yaakov descended into Mitzrayim, that all of Israel descended with him. And in fact, in last week's Torah portion of Parashat Vayechi, the Torah says that Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years. We read there in Genesis 47:28. Excuse me, I'll pull it back up on the screen over here. And it says, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim sheva esrei shana. Jacob lived in the land of Mitzrayim for 17 years. 17, it's interesting. 17 has a gematria, numerical value, with the Hebrew word tov, which means good. And so what we see is that Yaakov's 17 years in Mitzrayim were good years. And in fact, his family experienced great blessings in his merit. So the question we have to ask is, what happened to Yaakov's family between this week's Parashat and Parashat Vayechi? Now, I know they're not like a day apart from each other. There's many years that separate the two. But still, what happened that the Torah describes at the end of the Chumash of Bereishit, that the Jews were doing fairly well for themselves in Mitzrayim. They were blessed, they were prospering, they were having influence upon their non-Jewish counterparts there. But now suddenly things change. A new Paro rises. The second generation of Mitzrayim takes their eyes off of Hashem. So what happened? How did the blessings turn into difficult hardships? What happened here? Now, one of the things that you need to know is that Parashat Vayechi is what's called a parasha satuma. It's called a closed Torah portion. What does that mean? Well, in the Sefer Torah, every Torah portion, technically in Hebrew they're called a sidra or sidrot, but we colloquially refer to them as parshiot. Parsha is a paragraph, parshiot is paragraphs, right? Technically you're supposed to refer to, let's say, the Torah portion as a sidra, but we tend to use the word parasha. And so every sidra is separated by a 9-letter space. However, between Parashat Vayigash and Vayechi, there is no space. Now, the image that you see here, it's a normal. You have a space there, right? And so that space tells you exactly which section of the Torah portion you're reading. Okay, usually we divide the Torah portion into 7 aliyot on Shabbat. Okay, and between Vayigash and Vayechi, there's no spaces. So if the Baal Chorei goes to read the Torah scroll and he doesn't have a trained eye, which if he's been doing it for a while, he would know. But to, let's say, it's a bar mitzvah student, right? And they got to go in their parashas Vayechi. Well, they're going to have to open up to the Sefer Torah and they got to find out, well, where's Vayechi at, right? There's no separation there. And therefore, that's what's called a satuma. It's something closed. In fact, the Midrash wanted to ask this very question. Why is it a closed parasha? It says here in Bereishit Rabbah, Lama parasha zo satuma mechoha parshiyot shel Torah. Why all the portions of the Torah, is this portion closed? Why is that? It's because our father Yaakov passed away, and therefore, Shib'u Mitzrayim el Israel. That is when the bondage of Mitzrayim of Israel began. The bondage, the difficulties began. So the Midrash seems to indicate that as long as Yaakov Avinu was alive, his family was blessed. But once Yaakov died, then the family lost that blessing. Okay, well, let me ask this question. Did the Midrash not take into consideration that after the death of Yaakov, that Yosef lived for an additional 54 years? And while Yaakov was a pious and righteous man, the Torah teaches that the Jewish people benefited in the zechut or the merit of Yosef, since his descent into Mitzrayim is what allowed him to rise to power, and he took possession of the economy of Egypt. And therefore, it was Yosef that sustained the Jewish people. And in fact, when we look at last week's parasha, right after Yosef's brothers were concerned that he might be out for vengeance after Yaakov died, we see that he, basically brings comfort to his brothers and says, listen, I'm not out for blood. I can't, take the place of Hashem and be the arbitrator here when it comes to this. And he mentions that he's there to support them. He's there to sustain them. Vayomer alehem, Yosef el tira'u ki hatachat elokim ani. Yosef said, don't fear. Am I in place of God? Obviously, no. And he says, therefore, although you intended to harm me, God, he says, intended for good. In order to accomplish, he says, Kayom hazeh lechayot amrav, as it is clear today that a vast people be kept alive. Va'al al tira'u anochid, so therefore do not fear, because I, achalchel echem, will sustain you, ve'et tapechem, you and also your young ones. So what we see here is that Israel is being sustained in the zechut of Yosef. And it also would appear that the Midrash contradicts itself. Why is that? Because in this week's parasha, Shmuel Rabbah, the Midrash mentions that the Shibud Mitzrayim did not technically begin until the last son of Yaakov passed away. And so the Midrash then goes on and offers two additional interpretations explaining why Parashat Vayechi was a Parashat Satuma. And I'd like to take a look at these two different interpretations here in Bereishit Rabbah 96:1. And it says, Davar Acher, another interpretation, Lama Hi Satuma, why is this Parashat closed? And it says, because Yaakov Avinu sought to reveal to his sons the end. In other words, the Achlech HaYamim, as it says in last week's Parashat, when he gathered his sons together, right, when he was going to give the blessing, the Torah mentions that he was going to disclose what's going to happen in the end of days, but nothing was mentioned about what would happen in the end of days. Instead, it just mentioned him gives the blessing. And the reason why, the Midrash says here, is because the vision of the end of days was closed off from him. Therefore, he was not permitted to reveal the secret. And the Midrash then goes on with another interpretation, Lama Hi Satuma, why is this closed, this parashat? Well, it's because during Yaakov's sojourn in Mitzrayim, God, therefore, he says, closed off mimeno, from him, kol sarot sheba'olam, all the troubles, all the difficulties in the world. Now, these three different interpretations of the Midrash are very interesting, okay? It gives three interpretations on why Vayechi is a Parashat Stuma. One is because the Shibut Mitzrayim began. Two is because the Achlech HaYamim was concealed for Yaakov. And three is because trials and tribulations came to an end in Yaakov Avinu's life. Now, while upon the surface these three different interpretations don't appear to be related, the truth is they're actually saying the same thing but from different perspectives. Rashi comments upon the Midrash, and he says that the suffering of the Jewish people is what caused their eyes and their hearts to be closed. And also, the Chizkuni in his commentary says that the death of Yaakov caused his children to lose their hearts, it caused their children to close their hearts and their eyes to their spiritual mission. And because they allowed themselves to be closed off to their mission, they experienced the Shibut Mitzrayim, the hardships of Mitzrayim. This is why the second generation began to start to become assimilated into Egyptian society. They started losing their focus because they were disconnected from the source. Now, let's consider that whenever a new Sidra begins, that it's separated by a space of 9 letters. But in Parashat Vayechi, there is no separation. And considering what Rashi and the Chizkuni is saying in their commentary, that the Satuma Vayechi is a reflection of the descendants of Yaakov being closed off, we learn that if we read Vayechi directly from the end of Parashat Vayigash, we discover what the Midrash is trying to teach over here. So we'll go back over here to Genesis 47, 27 through 28. The Torah says, Vayishev Israel be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen vaye'achazu va vayirvu vayirbu me'od. So that's the last pasuk of Parashat Vayigash, which is not separated from Parashat Vayechi, where it says, and Israel settled in the land of Mitzrayim, in the land of Goshen. They acquired property, and they were fruitful and multiplied greatly. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim sheva esrei shana, and therefore Yaakov lived in the land of Mitzrayim 17 years. Vayehi yemei Yaakov shnei chaya sheva shanim v'arbaim um'at shana. And the days of Yaakov, the years of his life, were 147 years. Now, if we consider the Torah's description that the Jews prospered when Yaakov descended into Mitzrayim, okay, and by the way, I'd like to point out here that their prospering has nothing to do with just physical acquisition, like acquiring material. And I don't have the word highlighted here, but if you could read Hebrew, okay, right after the word Goshen, it says Vaye'achazu va vayirvu vayirbu me'od. That the Jews, they acquired, and it says property. That's not 100% accurate. It means that they seized something, they acquired something, and once they acquired it, and then vayifru vayirbu me'od, it allowed them not just to be fruitful and multiply, but also me'od, abundantly. Okay, what was it that they acquired that allowed them to become fruitful? It was the souls of the non-Jews, that they made gerim, okay, that they introduced the God of Israel into Egyptian society, a society that was steeped in paganism. Okay, the sages tell us that when Yosef became, the viceroy, okay, the Paro, that one of the things he started to do was to teach about his God, the God of his fathers. And also he had the men undergo circumcision. Okay, so he started to introduce holy sparks into Mitzrayim while he was gathering the souls. And so this is what Yaakov and them were doing. So the Jews' ability to be fruitful and multiply was based upon them collecting these holy sparks in Mitzrayim. And so what we see here is that the Jews prospered when Yaakov descended to Mitzrayim. And so what we see here is that we now understand, based upon this, we can understand the first interpretation of the Midrash that mentions that after Yaakov's death, the Shibut Mitzrayim began. Okay? In other words, the reason why the Shibut Mitzrayim began is because Yaakov's descendants took their focus off their primary objective. They were no longer connected to the Zechut of their grandfather Yaakov. They were no longer on the same page, the same mission that he was on. And because of that, now the bondage began to set in. The Midrash also, by the way, does not mean that after the physical death of Yaakov is when the Shibut Mitzrayim began. No, the Midrash is saying that when the Jews failed to walk in the actual Zechut of Yaakov, okay, and they wanted instead to depend upon the physical blessings that were associated with his merit, that allowed them to live comfortable in Mitzrayim, that is when the Shibut Mitzrayim began. That's very, very important, is when people who want to ride the coattails or in a bandwagon of somebody else's spiritual success, and yet they're not willing to also labor, okay, in trials and tribulations to produce their own merit. That becomes a problem as well. So when the Torah describes Yaakov living in Mitzrayim for 17 years, and 17 is the gematria of the word Tov, the Torah is teaching us that Yaakov was able to demonstrate to his children that no matter how far in exile you descend, you can only experience God's goodness as long as you are connected to Hashem. Now, considering that even though Yosef lived 54 years after Yaakov's death, it was not Yosef technically, it was not his merit technically that sustained the Jewish people. How so? Yosef was an extension of his father's zechut. This is why in Parashat Vayeshev and Vayechi, both of these Torah portions are connected with the number 17. In the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev, the Torah mentions that Yosef was 17 years old when he was shepherding his father's sheep, as we read there in Genesis 37, verse 1 through 2. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz mirorei Aviv. And it says in here, Yaakov settled in the land of his father's sojourning. And his father here, by the way, is a reference to Abraham. You go back to Parashat Vayetze, when God reveals himself in the Sulam, the vision of the ladder, and he says, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am, say Elohecha, but he says, I am Hashem. Actually, he says, I am the God, Elohai Avicha, of your father, he says, Avraham, of your father Avraham. And then he says, Ve'Elohei Yitzhak, and also the God of Yitzhak. Now, as I explained in that teaching, obviously Yitzhak is the Tati of Yaakov, not Avraham. Abraham's the Zaydi, he's the grandfather. Well, we know that, but according to Hashem's perspective, Avraham was the one who would then pass on that legacy that he received and install it into his grandson. Okay? So Yaakov is described as an Ish HaOhel, a man of the tent. Technically, is a man of the tents, it's in the plural there. And therefore, he was someone who was learned in the Torah that Abraham passed down to him. And so the legacy would continue with him. In a similar way, when Yaakov had his children, he didn't focus on the firstborn Ruvain, he didn't focus on Yehuda. Rather, he focused on Yosef. Okay, that's what it refers to. So when the Torah says, Yaakov, settled in the land of his father's sojournings, that refers to Abraham. Mirorei, okay, Avi Mirorei, which is the root there, Ger, okay, his sojournings is also a concept of making Gerim, converts, okay? And so it says here, Be'eretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan. And then it says, Eli Toledot Yaakov, and these are the descendants, the chronicles of Yaakov. Yosef ben Sheva Esrei Shana Haya Roeh. Yosef at the age of 17 was a shepherd. So what we see here is that the first 17 years of Yosef's life was sustained in the zechut of Yaakov. Now in Parashat Vayechi, the Torah mentions that Yaakov dwelled in Mitzrayim for 17 years, as it says here on the screen, Genesis 47, 27 to 28. Vayeshev Israel be'eretz Mizrayim be'eretz Goshen Vaye'achazu. Oh, by the way, that's the end of Vayigash. I apologize. We'll just focus here in the yellow from Vayechi. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mizrayim Sheva Ezrei Shana. Yaakov lived in the land of Mitzrayim 17 years. Once again, 17 has a gematria of Tov. And what we learn from this is that the 17 years of Yaakov's life, of Mitzrayim was sustained by the zechut of Abraham that was then invested into Yosef. And so this means that Yaakov was technically sustained off his own zechut. How is that possible? Well, because in Vayeshev, Yosef was sustained in the merit of Yaakov. Even though Yosef rose to power in Mitzrayim, it was still in Yaakov's zechut that basically Yosef achieved such a lofty position. Okay, you got to remember, Yosef was able to overcome the temptation of Potiphar's wife. He was able to overcome the darkness and the tumah of Mitzrayim because of that inner strength that he received from his father, from the Torah that he was taught. And therefore, that's why I explained there in Vayeshev, okay, that when Potiphar's wife is going to make the move on Yaakov, it says there that he adamantly refused. Vayma'ain, it said there, and it had the shashelet trope, which refers to a chain and it sounds like a siren. And the only other time the word of Vaymain is being used is back when Yaakov refused to be comforted regarding the alleged death of Yosef. And so because the shashelet is a chain, it connects one to the other, we see that Yosef's ability to have such great strength in Mitzrayim came from his father, came from the Torah that he taught him. And so how this works is much like what's called an ROI in the financial world, which means a return on investment. Yaakov continued in the zechut of Abraham, and what he invested into himself was then invested into Yosef. Yosef then increased in his father's zechut, much like how interest increases on investment. And so when Yaakov descended into the depths of exile, into Mitzrayim, he was able to reap the goodness of God's blessing because Yosef was simply an extension of him. That's how that worked. Now, if you consider how the Torah goes from using the name Israel when relating to the experiencing the goodness of Mitzrayim, when it says at the beginning, Vayishev Israel be'eretz Mitzrayim, and Israel settled in the land of Mitzrayim, be'eretz, basically be'eretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen in Genesis 47:27. And then it switches to the name Yaakov in verse 28, Genesis 47:28, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim, and Yaakov lived in the land of Mitzrayim. And then it switches back in verse 29 to the name Israel, when it talks about the days of death drew near to Israel. Vayichrevu Yemei Israel Lamud, as I taught in my teaching of Vayechi, that the days of dying drew near to Israel. That it would basically appear that the Jews experienced blessing in the zechut of Israel. In other words, the Israel part of Yaakov, which is what died, as I taught in Vayechi. And therefore, when the Israel part of Yaakov died, that means that the blessings that the Jews experienced in that merit of that name also died. It died because Yaakov's descendants were not walking in the merit of Israel, fulfilling their spiritual mission. This is why when you read the Tanakh, we see that sometimes the name of Israel is being associated with, obviously Israel is Israel, the Jews are called Israel, but that name that they're identified with reflects them walking in the same merit of their ancestor Yaakov. So when the Midrash teaches that Vayechi is called a Parashat Satuma, is because Yaakov was closed off from experiencing any more trials and tribulations. His children failed to understand that the trials that Yaakov encountered are what produced the blessings. They are what produced blessings for him. So when Yaakov's Torah duty was finished in this world, there were no more trials and tribulations. And so his children utilized the blessing of prosperity much like it was some form of inheritance. And because his children fail to understand that unless that inheritance is invested, in other words, by enduring hardships and tribulations, which develops your character, well, there's no interest to be generated then. And so, as the Torah tells us in this week's Parsha, the spiritual inheritance money ran out. A new Paro rose to power. And now the Jews are going to feel difficulty. They never experienced this before. Okay, I hate to say it, but they were kind of sheltered, okay? Living off of the zechut of their ancestors. They were kind of like spiritual snowflakes. And so now when difficulty arises, they start to feel hardships. They start to cry out to God. And because the Jewish people were not walking in that spiritual merit of Yaakov, except for Yosef, by the way, this brings us to the Midrash's third interpretation of why Vayechi is called a Parashat Satuma. And the Midrash mentioned that because Yaakov sought to reveal the secrets of the Achar HaYamim, the end of days, it was concealed from them. He couldn't reveal it to them. The Kli Yakar in his commentary explains that as long as Yaakov's children were not willing to continue in the merit of their father, Rather, they wanted to reap the physical blessings that he spiritually generated by going through his trials and tribulations. They were not worthy of the divine revelation regarding what would happen in the end of days. Only those who walk in the spiritual merit of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov are worthy to receive the divine secrets of redemption. Only those are worthy of divine inspiration. This is so important for a lot of us to understand, especially if we desire to have insights and fresh chidush of the Torah. Hashem will not reveal these things to us if we're not worthy, if we're not willing to undergo hardships and difficulties to work upon ourselves. The purpose of Israel's exile is that the Jews are required to seek Hashem and implore Him for the redemption. And this will occur only if the date of redemption is concealed. And so by keeping the date of redemption concealed, it forces a person to yearn for exile to come to an end and to plead with Hashem to bring the Mashiach. On the other hand, if the Jews would have a secure knowledge of when the redemption would occur, even if it was in the distant future, well, there would be a chance that they would cease to pray for it. Okay? They would cease to pray for it. This is almost like why when Hashem brought the Jews into the wilderness and He brought the manna, right? Some of the commentaries ask, couldn't God have just brought a year's supply worth of manna? Why every day? Because God knows. If He would bring a year's supply worth of manna, the people would become so complacent. They wouldn't seek Him. They wouldn't cry out to Him. They wouldn't develop a relationship with Him. They would become complacent. But yet, by making the Jews dependent upon the manna day to day, it kept that relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and them very fresh, very intimate. And therefore, those who were truly faithful to Hashem, they would seek His face every day. Because the redemption did not appear to be so imminent, the Torah tells us that Yaakov's children, apart from Yosef, since Yaakov did reveal the secrets of redemption to him, and also according to Chazal, his two sons Ephraim and Manasseh, basically the rest of his sons thought they could sit there and settle and reap the physical benefits of their father's spiritual success. And this type of attitude is what made them lose their aspirations for redemption. In fact, by the time we get to Parashat Vayira, next week's Torah portion over there in Exodus 6:9, when Moshe Rabbeinu goes to the Jewish people, the Torah says, "V'lo shem'u el Moshe mikotze ruach," that the people could not hear Moses because it says they were short of breath. That's how some translations will say it. I beg to differ. V'lo shem'u el Moshe. The people did not believe Moshe. Why? Mikotze ruach, because of unbelief. Because they didn't have belief. They were tired of believing in this goel, in this geulah. They had doubt. That's what that means. And the Kli Yakar explains that even though God informed Abraham that his descendants would descend into a 400-year exile, and the Jews had this information, nevertheless, it did not make them yearn for redemption. So the attitude of many Jewish people was like, just relax. Hashem told Avraham Avinu, we're going to be here for about 400 years, so let's make the best of it. So what are we going to do? We'll buy the best homes we could buy. We'll send our kids to the best Egyptian schools we could send them. We'll invest in a nice retirement plan. And you know what? 400 years in the future, our people will leave here. Okay, they'll be ready to move, and whatever we could save up for them in that time, they could take it with them. And so what happened was they became complacent. And complacency is a silent killer because it makes people become heretics of their own faith. That's why when Moshe Rabbeinu appeared on the scene, that people couldn't believe what he was saying. Geulah, you're a Goel, this Redeemer, God, what? They couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it because they were so burdened and oppressed by their day-to-day activities in Mitzrayim, working hard hours just to keep some food on the table and to pay their bills. They became complacent. And sadly, friends, if we're not careful, we can also become complacent. And we sit there and think, the world is going to hell. The world is getting dark. The world is calling, evil good and good is evil. And we sit there and we just twiddle our thumbs or we make a post on the internet about it, right? Like we're keyboard warriors, and we say, it doesn't matter because, Hashem is going to send a Mashiach. Mashiach will come and fix everything. Yeah? Okay, Mashiach's going to fix everything? Okay, and then Hashem is going to talk to us and say, why were we complacent when it came to bringing Mashiach? Why weren't we proactive in our observance of mitzvot and doing good deeds, right? We're going to be held accountable for our complacency. And so the problem with this type of mentality, friends, is that it does not generate spiritual merit. Many of us, we credit the name of a Mashiach or a Sadiq or a great Rebbe, and we attribute everything to them. And yet, what are we doing? We just want to come along like people on the bandwagon. Oh, we want to praise this person, acknowledge them. But what are we generating? We rather benefit off of somebody else's success instead of laboring spiritually to produce our own merit. And this is the problem, why the secrets of redemption and knowing the depths of God's Torah is completely concealed from people. Because they rather basically be freeloaders instead of actually laboring themselves. God's Shekhinah reveals the depths of His Word only to those who walk in the merit of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. In fact, the Chatam Sofer in this week's Parashat, he comments upon this, and he says, slavery is not referring to the Mitzrayim's persecutions, but to Yaakov's descendants' disheartening opinion that once their father was no longer alive, the Torah Abraham instructed his descendants to walk in no longer had to be observed. They felt that they only had to observe Torah out of indebtedness to the fathers, not out of an enthusiastic desire to Hashem's will. This half-hearted attachment of God is why we suffer the hardships of exile. And boy, oh boy, just as the Chatam Sofer said that over 100-something years ago, it also makes sense today as well. It makes a lot of sense today. How many people truly serve Hashem out of enthusiasm, out of a zeal, out of true, genuine joy? Or they just do it with half-hearted attachment because, I'm Jewish, I'm supposed to do this. Or I need to go through the motions, right? And there's no kavanah, there's no connection. This is sadly what happened to many of the Jews in Mitzrayim and why 4/5 perished and only 1/5 of the Jewish people made it out. Sadly, you see a lot of this happen with many Jews in North America today. So assimilated, they have no connection to the Torah. There is no spiritual connection there. And so this brings me to the main point of my teaching today. In this week's Torah portion, we read that after the spiritual inheritance money ran out, that when the old Paro died and a new Paro came to power, that the Jewish people were forced into a position that made their stay in Mitzrayim a living hell. And the Torah says that the discomfort that the Jews felt is what made them cry out to Hashem. Once again, we read here in Exodus 2:23, "Vaye'anechu v'nei Israel min ha'avodah, vayizachu v'ta'al shav atam el Elokim min ha'avodah." The children of Israel groaned from the work. Their cry ascended, crying to God from the work. Now, I explained earlier that the word avodah is not just limited to work or bondage, but can also mean worship. And not worship in the sense of someone prostrating or singing a song to God. Rather, worship is a lifestyle. It's a form of communicating with God. It's what one is attached to. And communication doesn't have to be verbal. Communication could be body language. It could be what you do with your energy, what you spend your money on, what you focus on with your eyes, what you dedicate your time to. The sages explained that the dichotomy between Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, and their descendants is communication. And so, like real estate, there are 3 important things that a person needs to keep in mind. Location, location, location. Spiritually speaking, location is related to one's proximity to God, and one's proximity is based upon communication. Every Thursday, we read from the Shir Shalom Yom, the Song of the Day. We read from Psalm 81, and there, David HaMelech, when he compiled that psalm, it was based upon the Jews' journey in the wilderness. And there we read that God reminded the Jews how He elevated them from the land of Mitzrayim, and He desired for them to open their mouth so He can fulfill their request of prayer. We read here in Psalm 81, 11-12. God says, "Anochi Adonai Elohecha, hama'acha me'eretz Mizrayim, harchev picha va'amalechu." I am Hashem, your God, who raised you from the land of Mitzrayim. Open wide your mouth, and I will fill it. V'lo shema ami lechuli v'Israel lo avali. But my people Israel did not heed my voice. Israel did not desire me. This phrase here you see highlighted in yellow, harchev picha, refers to prayer. Open your mouth. It refers to prayer. It says that God wanted the Jewish people to know that they would communicate with Him like their ancestors did, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They would also experience great success. However, David wrote, "Velo shema ami lekoli." Rather, my people Israel did not heed my voice. Ve'Israel lo avali. My people Israel did not desire me. Did not desire me. Why would somebody be willing to settle in the struggles of this world, only to spend an entire lifetime grinding and hustling for a temporary piece of existence. God says that He desires for us to open our mouth, harchev picha, va'amale'ehu, in order to be intimate with Him so He can fill our request. For many people, they refuse to do this, and they rather settle on living off the spiritual inheritance of somebody else. They go through their hardships, and you know what? They rather sit there and hear a good story or learn about somebody else's success. I can't stand people like that. I can't. I don't want to hear you talking to me about, oh, this person has a nice house, this person has a nice car. So what? Why don't you have a nice car? Why don't you have a nice house? Why are you telling me about someone else's success? Baruch Hashem, that's nice that they have those things. Good. But what about you? Why are you worried about them and yet you have addictions, you have hardships, you have problems? Why is that? Why focus on the spiritual inheritance money? Or even more when it comes to religious people, and they focus on the spiritual dynamics of what made people such unique tzaddikim. Oh, they were so righteous. They did this, they did that. Okay, no. And what about you? Why can't you be as spiritually great as that person? What do you think? There's a difference between you and them? You think that the Hashem, he's partial, He plays favorites? He doesn't. It's all up to our bechira, our free will. So I don't want to hear stories about how successful this person is or how great spiritually that person is. When you yourself can be that great. You yourself could be that powerful. When God created man, okay, the Torah tells us that man became a lenefesh chaya, Genesis 2:7. Okay? Vayitza Adonai Elohim et ha'adam afar mehadama. And Hashem Elohim formed man of the dust from the ground. Vayipach be'apav nishma chayim vayihi ha'adam lenefesh chaya. He blew into man, into his nostrils, the soul, nishmat, the neshama of life. And it says man became a lenefesh chaya, a living being. Now what's interesting is that the Aramaic translations of this verse, Onkelos, he translates lenefesh chaya as man becoming leruach mimala. Man became a speaking spirit. That's interesting. So the Aramaic understands lenefesh chaya, man became a living being. That it's not just man is a living being, but man is a ruach mimala. Man is a speaking spirit. That changes the whole understanding of what that means in Hebrew. Why is that important? Well, because if you go a little bit back in the creation story, specifically in Genesis chapter 1, verse 20 to 21, the Torah says there that the animal kingdom is also nefesh chaya. Okay? We'll pull up on the screen. The animal kingdom is nefesh chaya. We see here in Genesis 1:20. And it says, Vayomer Elokim, Yishretzu Hamayim, Sheretz Nefesh Chaya. God said, let the waters teem with teeming, living things. And therefore let the fowl that fly about the earth, over the earth, across the expanses of heaven. And it says, God created the great sea giants and every what? Called Nefesh HaChaya. And every living being that creeps with which waters teemed after their kinds, and all winged fowl of every kind. And therefore, Vayirar Elokim Ki Tov, God saw that it was good. Nefesh Chaya, the Torah says, the animals are Nefesh Chaya. It says man is Nefesh Chaya. But there's a difference with man. That means we share a similarity at the lowest aspect of the soul that we call the Nefesh. That means your dog and your cat, or the donkey, okay, that's in the backyard, all share a similar level of the soul with you. In fact, we call that the nefesh behemah, the animal soul, that when man falls to a low level and acts out of sinful impulses is from his animal instinct. Now animals, they act based upon what's programmed in their DNA, so they're animals. In fact, I would say they do a better job than us. I've never seen a squirrel commit suicide because they can never find work. I've never seen a raccoon abuse antidepressants because his marriage was falling apart. Just never seen that stuff happen. Now, mind you, we've seen some animals, brawl and fight over food and stuff like that, right? But humans do it a lot worse. The Targums say man is a nefesh chai, which is a ruach memala. Now, if we take a look here back in Genesis 2:7, we see that when the Torah calls man a nefesh chai, that there's a prefix lamet, le nefesh chaya. That prefix lamet is called the lamet of change. What does that mean? Well, when God blew his breath into man, a piece of himself, vayipach be'apav nishma chaim. The neshama, from the root word neshama, which means to exhale. That neshama that dwells in you and me is what makes us different than the animal kingdom. So once that was deposited within to us, the Torah then says, Vayihi ha'adam, not just Adam, but ha'adam, the man, is lenefesh chaya. That means that he has something different than the rest of the creation that's nefesh chaya. Okay, that means he's something different within his nature. Yes, he could share a similarity of the animal soul, nefesh behemah, but he could transcend that. And therefore, the Aramaic comes along and says, man is ruach mimala. Man is a speaking spirit. That's fascinating. Why is that so unique? Well, speech is the crowning faculty that distinguishes man from the animals. Now, don't get me wrong, animals communicate, right? Your dog wants something, he barks. Your cat wants something, it meows. The dolphins, they use it, whatever, like, Flipper the dolphin type of stuff. They make noises, right? We're not talking about speech in that form of communication. We're talking in a spiritual language. Within every descendant of Adam HaRishon is a fragmented piece of Hashem that we call the neshama. And so instead of acting out of animalistic impulse, we cry out to God from the depths of a neshama. Considering that Hashem, the master of the universe, created light years of galaxies, and each galaxy is a gravitational bound system of stars, stellar remnants, interstellar gas, dust, and dark matter. The very fabric of the Bria, the creation, is you and me. Man is the byproduct of the entire creation, and therefore God desires intimacy with man much more than he desires intimacy with the angels who reside over invisible spiritual dimensions that govern the physical parts of creation. In fact, consider that man out of all creation was created B'Tselem Elohim in the divine image. And it's interesting that when you compare the creation of man to the angels, David HaMelech tells us that the angels are spirits composed of fire. We read here in Psalm 104 verse 4. David says, Osei malachav ruchot misharatav esh. He produced his ministering angels of lohet, a spiritual fire. A malach, an angel, when you think upon it, does not have a digestive system. He's an entity of fire. And as an entity of fire, an angel is not hindered by the inconvenience and the embarrassment of having to use the bathroom. Men, on the other hand, no matter how powerful, how influential, or how beautiful, is faced with the reality that he needs to depend on a bathroom to live. Think about that. How can such a being be created Tselem Elohim? How? Couldn't God have created man with like an internal combustion system or some type of internal incinerator where when the food is consumed, it's automatically burned up, and somewhere on man's body is like a small exhaust pipe that releases some smoke, right? So why did Hashem create man the way he did? Why? Because he wanted to hear man thank him, to call upon him in the time of need. There's a certain prayer that we have, okay, for those who don't know about this prayer, it's called Asher Yatzar. It's a prayer that we give thanks to God after we use the bathroom, okay? A lot of people may not know about this, but for those who are observant, they know about this prayer. And the prayer here, it says over here, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, Asher Yatzar et ha'adam, b'chachma uv'chavod nechavin chaluli chalulin, who formed man with wisdom and created within him all manner of openings and all manners of cavities. Galui v'yadu lifnei chisei chavodecha she'in yipateach echad behem o yisatem echad behem afshar lehit chayem v'la'amol lefenecha. And it's known before your glorious throne that if one of those openings or cavities ruptured or was blocked, it would not be possible to survive and to stand before you. Afilu she'achad baruch atah Hashem rofe chol basar umafli la'asot. Blessed are you, Hashem, who heals all flesh and is wondrous in his acts. Who actually stops and thinks while they're in the bathroom about how God made the human body? Who stops and thinks upon those things? Most people are probably on their cell phone, right? Wasting their time watching YouTube. In the case of a dire emergency, however, when a person's health is on the line, that's when they start to contemplate about the body. That's when they start to realize, man, I should never ate that amount of food because now my arteries are clogged up, chasas chalila. Or a person's having another diabetic seizure, too much sugar right? Their triglyceride levels are exploding. That's when they start to think upon their body. So the point of the prayer here is that God could have made us different, sure. But he made our anatomical structure the way he did because he wants us to realize that he's looking over our health, okay? And therefore God looks over us every second of the day. And so what we have to understand here is that we're not in control. God's in control of everything, and we must learn to give thanks to him. What's interesting about this concept is the Torah tells us later on, Parashat Beshalach, that after the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, the Torah tells us there in Exodus 14:10. It says, "Ufaro hirri vayiseu v'nei Israel et enechem v'hinei Mizraim nose achareihem." That Pharaoh drew near to the children of Israel, and the children of Israel raised their eyes and beheld that Mitzrayim was journeying after them. Vayireu me'od, and they were greatly afraid. Vayizaku v'nei Israel el Adonai, and therefore the children of Israel began to cry out to Hashem. Vayizaku. Right? The root word there is ach, which refers to one who calls out in dire need because they need help. They're desperate. Just like how it's used in this week's Parashat, Exodus 2:23. The Midrash comes along and comments and says that God wanted the Jews to cry out because he desired to help them. That God deliberately allowed Paro and the Mitzrayim to come behind the Jews. He did it on purpose while they're stuck at the Yam Suf, because he wanted to hear them to have an intimate conversation with him. Midrash Tachuma explains this here. Va'av kan vayizachu v'nei Israel el Hashem. The Bnei Israel begin to cry out to Hashem. Therefore, tafeshu umanut avotehen, embracing the skill of their fathers. What's that skill? Tefillah, which is prayer. And whenever they cry out to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, is accessible to them, as it says in Deuteronomy 4:29. It says, Uvik shetem misham et Adonai, and from there you shall seek Hashem Elohecha, your God, umatzata, and you will find him. You will find him. And so it would appear, friends, that the Jews were relying on the merits of Moshe Rabbeinu at the Yam Suf, much like they were trying to rely on the zechut of Yaakov. Instead of seeking Hashem like Moshe and Yaakov, God got their attention by allowing Paro to draw near to them. And this caused them to cry out for B'tzita D'Shemaya, for great heavenly assistance. And so when we consider how Hashem uses circumstances to get us to call out to him, okay, we have to understand that he's doing that because he desires an intimacy with us. He desires to have a unique conversation with us. In fact, I'm reminded of another story that takes place over in the Tanakh, over there in Shmuel Aleph in 1 Samuel, where the Torah tells us about Hannah, the mother of Shmuel Hanavi. And the Tanakh tells us that Hannah was barren. She was infertile. And worse than that, she also suffered ridicule, okay, from Elkanah's other wives, Peninnah. That Peninnah would mock Hannah. Oh, you're infertile, you can't have children, you're sloppy seconds, making fun of her. So who created Hannah barren? Hashem did. Hashem created her that way. Hashem knew she would be in a situation where she would be mocked and ridiculed. And as you know, the story goes that she would begin crying out to Hashem from the depths, Mima Amakim, from the depths of her heart. Crying out to Hashem so much that the Kohen Gadol, Eli, thought she was drunk. And then when she told him, no, I'm not drunk, I'm crying out from the depths of my heart. And the Tanakh says that after crying out to Hashem from the depths of her heart, her prayer was answered as she became pregnant with Shmuel Hanavi. And there we read in Hannah's prayer how she describes God by an interesting title. We read over there in Shmuel Aleph, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 2. It says, Ein kadosh ka Adonai, ki ein biltecha ve'ein sur ki Eloheinu. There is none as holy as Hashem, for there is none besides you, and there is no rock like our God. Hannah came to learn that her inability to have a child was not because of a genetic disposition. It wasn't because of bad luck. Rather, it was because it was the will of Hashem. God used Hannah's inability to conceive as a conduit to draw close to him in intimate prayer. In fact, in the Sidurs, the prayer, Ein ke Eloheinu, was inspired from Hannah's prayer. Ein ke Eloheinu, etc., for those that know that melody. Once again, Chana said, Ki ein biltecha, that there is none besides you, Hashem. Ein chamocha, there is none. Meaning that everything that happens to a person in this life comes from Hashem and Hashem alone. Ein ol melvado, there is no other reality. And then she said, Ve'ein sor ki Elohinu, there is no rock like our God. Why? Because we can rest assured that whatever comes at us that comes from Hashem, that our emunah and bitachon is on a solid rock, an impenetrable rock. And that's the one we put our trust in, is the Sor Israel, the rock of Israel. The sages come along and they tell us, they say, hey, you know what? Don't read Chana's words as Ve'ein Sor ke Elohinu, there's no rock like our God, but rather read Ein Sarir ke Elohinu, that there's no artist like our God. Fascinating. What does Chazal mean that there's no artist like our God? I mean, what is Chazal describing God like he's Bob Ross? You know, you guys remember the gentleman Bob Ross with the painter, you know, a little green here, little sunshine there, little bush over here. I mean, this is Hashem, you know, a little infertility here, a little 10 plagues here. I mean, what's Chazal meaning? I mean, he's an artist. Yes, he's a craftsman, but what does this mean? Chazal understood that God is a master painter. And therefore, when he came to the life of Chana, he depicted her life as a woman ridiculed for not being able to have a child. But when Chana understood that as the master painter of life, Hashem has the ability to recreate a person's life in a new dimension, that's when she cried out to Hashem from the depths of her heart. And her prayer is what enabled the paintbrush of God to change her status of being someone barren and ridiculed to being able to conceive and praise as a woman who gave birth to one of the Jewish people's mightiest prophets. So when she said, Ve'ein sor ke Elohinu, there's no rock like our God, and Chazal say we read that as Ve'ein, we read that as Ein Sarir ke Elohinu, there's no artist like our God. Chazal understood that, you know, Michelangelo may have created the image of creation in the Sistine Chapel, but his paintbrush cannot undo the blemish of Adam HaRishon. Hashem's paintbrush, on the other hand, is able to erase a person's blemishes, to erase a person's sorrows, and to create a new beginning. And so in order to make Hashem's paintbrush to work, a person must communicate with Hashem. David HaMelech in Psalm 55:23 tells us that we need to throw our burdens on Hashem. He says over there, Hashlech al Adonai, cast your burdens, throw your burdens upon Hashem. And he will sustain you. He will sustain you. David is saying, you know, it's not just cast your burdens. He's saying to go with throw your burdens upon Hashem. Just toss it upon him without a worry. When you toss something, you don't look back and worry about it. You just toss it and move on. That's what David HaMelech is saying. Just throw your burdens to Hashem and he will sustain you. He will sustain you. And so what we have to understand, friends, is regardless of what we may be going through at the current moment in life, David HaMelech wants us to understand that when we throw our burdens upon Hashem, we can rest assured that he's going to take our burdens and sustain us. The reason why God has to force many of us into difficult situations is because the only way we can open our mouth and speak to him is when we're going through the hardships of life. When God is pressing us. That's what he does. I want to close here with a fascinating story I heard. I would say fascinating, an inspiring story, I should say. Many years ago in Israel, there was a rabbi who was living in Mir Sharim. For those who don't know, Mir Sharim is an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. And this rabbi was going through a very discouraging time. He had a son and daughter who were about in their middle 30s and they were not married yet. Now, for the ultra-Orthodox, that's a big issue, to marry off your kids and have grandkids and to keep that legacy going on. But here he is with a son and daughter, both middle 30s, and they don't have a shidduch yet. So for many years they attempted to find a proper shidduch, but they were unsuccessful. And so concerned that he would not have any grandchildren, he would not have anyone to carry on the family's legacy, the rabbi was very sad. And he was wondering, why was Hashem allowing this to happen? What did he do wrong? What did his kids do wrong? Why is this going on? So one day the rabbi was sitting outside of a local corner store, and he noticed that there was a 7-year-old boy who went to the store to carry a carton of eggs, right? He had about 2 cartons of eggs. And as the boy was leaving the store, he was having difficulty carrying the eggs, and he wanted to be very meticulous not to break the eggs. He didn't want to upset his mom. So he would stop every couple of feet trying to readjust the eggs, right? And he kept doing this little by little. And he saw that the child was struggling. So the rabbi offered the young boy that he can for help. And the young boy was so happy. He says, "Oh, thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you so much." And he says, "My home is only about 500 feet away." And as the rabbi was walking behind the young child, he noticed that the young child was just happy. He was giving God praise. He was saying, "Toda Abba, thank you Hashem, Hodu Adonai." How give thanks to Hashem, Ki le'olam chasdo, for his kindness endures forever. Just thanking Hashem that Hashem sent the rabbi at the right time to help him bring the eggs home. And as they reached the boy's house, the mother thanked the rabbi for helping the child out, waved goodbye to the rabbi. As the rabbi turned the corner, he just stopped. With his face up to heaven, he began to have tears stream down his cheek. And he said with tears, he says, "Avi Shabbat, my Father in heaven, how much more should I be like that little boy? What I think are big burdens in life are nothing but a couple of carton eggs to you. You desire to carry my burdens so that I can be happy in serving you. Please forgive me. Please forgive me for not giving you my burdens. I'm so sorry." After engaging in his heartfelt prayer, a miracle happened. 8 months later, the rabbi's son and daughter both found shidduchim, and they were both married, and they both had children. The Torah tells us, friends, that once the Jewish people began to cry out to Hashem from the level of shavatam el ha'elokim and ha'avodah, from the state of being broken, that is when God responded to their cry. When they were broken, when they exhausted all their resources, and God got them into a corner. And so it's in times of life when Hashem has to allow us to feel broken in order for us to maximize our spiritual potential. And while it's a liberating feeling, the truth is many people abuse the broken process. They go into a cycle of being broken. They want people to listen to their woes and all their troubles and, woe is me and why is this and come on, save that for Dr. Phil or Oprah. Hashem doesn't like people who kvetch, people who act like a shlamil. Oh, poor me, right? That's not going to get you anywhere. That's a state of yiyush, of despair. Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, and Yosef, they were able to walk in each other's own spiritual merit because they all cried out to God from a state of being broken. Each and every one of their lives are filled with trials and tribulations. God had to put their descendants into a position to teach them how to communicate with Him just like they did. And so, friends, if we want to experience the goodness of God in the depths of our exile, we need to cry out to Him from the depths of our heart. Psalm 130 says it's a shir hama'alot, a song of ascension. But then it says, Mi ma'amakim, kira'iticha Adonai, from the depths I cry out to you, Hashem. It's only when you cry out from the depths can you ascend. And therefore we need to sincerely thank Hashem for using life's hardships to draw us close to Him. If we simply want to jump on the gravy train of benefiting for somebody else's spiritual inheritance, and we want to be enamored by somebody else's success, and you know what, friend? The ways of Hashem will be concealed from us, chassis chalila. We will not grow in understanding Torah. We won't understand the great secrets of God's Torah. These things will be concealed from us. God does not want us basically riding on the success of somebody else. He wants us to be able to produce our own zechut. And that could only happen when we go through our trials and tribulations, when we seek the face of our Father in heaven. So I want to challenge you, whoever this message may appeal to. You may be finding yourself in a difficult situation right now, and you don't know why God is doing what He's doing. You need to understand nothing happens in this world without the Creator's consent. Hannah came to understand this, and therefore she pressed through, and God opened that womb. God opened the womb for Hannah. And Chazal said, hey, it's not just this Ein, Sur Ke Eloheinu, it's Ein Sa'ir Ke Eloheinu. There's no artist like our God. So sure, God somewhere in time, before you came into this world, like Bob Ross, he was sitting there with a portrait. And he was sitting there dabbing a little tribulation here, a little difficulty there, a little health issue here, a little financial issue over there, a little marital issue here, family issues over here. Oh yeah, a little touch of anger here. Hashem was allowing all that to happen because He's going to see if you're going to have the emunah and betachon, the faith and trust to approach Him and challenge that paintbrush and watch God be able to change something that looks disastrous into something wonderful. But it's up to you, friend. It's up to you. And therefore, this is why I subtitled this teaching From Out of the Depths. It's from out of the depths that we are able to make an ascension to Hashem. And therefore, the Torah tells us that if Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, and many other great righteous leaders are examples of crying up from the depths to ascending to success, it can be the same for you and me. You and me are the problem then if we don't actually engage in a heartfelt discussion with our Father in heaven. So I'd like to challenge you, Chavarim, as we now enter into this new Chumash Shemot. Don't become spiritually complacent. Don't try to benefit off the spiritual success from others. Continue to generate merit. Continue to cry out from the depths and let your Father in heaven allow you to ascend from out of Mitzrayim. Because Mitzrayim is not just limited to a location somewhere in the Middle East. Mitzrayim is Metzar. It's a place of constriction. It represents the Yetzer Hara, represents our limitations. God says, I want to take you from out of Mitzrayim. I want you to harchev picha. I want you to open your mouth. Va'ama le'ehu, so I can fill it, God says. There's such desire of our Father in heaven. He wants to fulfill our requests. But sadly, the rest of that pasuk says, my people did not desire me. You know how saddening that has to be? That God desires to want to answer us. He desires to be in intimate conversation with us, but we don't desire Him. That's a very tragic thing within itself. Chassis Chalila, friend. Don't be like what happened to many of the Jewish people in the wilderness. Don't be that stubborn and ignorant. Open your mouth wide and expand. Enter into an intimate rendezvous with your Father in heaven and let Him answer your prayer. Be a testimony for somebody else who needs to hear what you have gone through. That God is in the business of bringing us out of Mitzrayim. So Chavarim, I hope that these teachings are a blessing to you and they're a challenge to you. And once again, if our organization here has been a blessing to you, prayerfully consider supporting us financially. We have the links below in the description of the video. If you click what says see more, we have a link to our PayPal. We thank you for your donations and support. We also have our building fund. Currently right now we're raising $65,000. So if you would like to donate to us for our building fund, we greatly appreciate it. For those who have supported and donated, thank you so much for your support and your continued support. And also, for those who would like to know, we have just recently dropped our subscription services. So Shevi'im Panim LaTorah, or 70facesoftorah.com, which is the Beit Midrash Sulam Yaakov. We have a subscription service. You can go over there to the website. You can sign up for monthly subscription or annual subscription. You can get access either to just MP3s alone or the videos that you see here, which also include the PDF documents for the source sheets. So if you also like to be able to use these in your own studies, you can do so as well. And also there's other information on there. Feel free to go check it out. If you have any questions, you can drop us an email and we'll get back to you as soon as the email comes in. And other than that, if you have any questions regarding any of the things I teach, feel free to drop me a line at rabbi@70facesoftorah.com. I will get back to those in the order that they come in. Until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your families. Shalom and Kol Tov.